Africa, a continent teeming with life, diversity, color, and adventure. A continent ever challenging its people to face issues of health, governance, change, education, identity, and developing economies. A continent wonderfully responsive to the gospel for more than a century. Churches abound, Christians rejoice, communities change.
I was 9 years old when God called my attention to the possibilities of the gospel in Africa. 9 years later, 18, I was on my way to Bible college. 4 years later, I married Judy, and we became lifelong companions in this venture. 1 year after that, we were on our way to Africa, and in 1967, Judy and I began work in Zimbabwe, which was then called Southern Rhodesia. In 1972, we shifted to Zambia, and it was there in 1975 that discipleship became central to our ministry.
By 1975, I realized that we had done everything that we'd ever dreamed about doing, but I was convicted that we weren't doing the one thing that Jesus really asked us to do, told us to do, and that was to make disciples. That's what the Great Commission is all about. I'd never made disciples. I'd never been a disciple. I didn't know how to make disciples. So I realized that Larry Niemeyer, had to be changed first. And that led to transitions that have been central to our ministries ever since.
The beginnings of discipleship in Zambia prompted us to seek more effective discipleship beginnings in Kenya in 1982. Among other things, we created new discipleship tools. Those tools contain the basic principles of the discipleship effort that has taken place ever since. They were designed, number one, for life-to-life ministry, whereby a discipler would take up to 1 year with one person. Number two, a clear focus on God at the center of our lives was central to each one of them. Number three, clear aims for God-inspired transformation in 10 definitive areas of Christian living. Number four, an expectancy for the disciples to become disciple makers. Number five, for disciplers to simply disciple people from their entire social networks, not just from their churches. And number six, for an expectancy of God's multiplication of disciple makers at the rate of doubling oneself every year. And finally, number seven, continuous mobilization. After several versions, we ended up with 4 books that became the core of this ministry. The first book is called Foundations for Discipleship Mobilization. It concentrated on transformations in the areas of confidence, consistency, and stability. The second book is called Fruitfulness in Discipleship Mobilization, and it seeks transformation in Christ-likeness, evangelism, and discipleship itself. The third book is called Building Discipleship Foundations, and is designed to help new disciple makers discover their God-inspired strengths for motivating and conserving new disciples. And then the fourth book is called Bearing Discipleship Fruitfulness, and helps the new disciple makers to discover their own, again, God-inspired strengths, but this time for proclamation and multiplication.
We just want to see God continuing what he began in the lives of the disciples. In Philippians 1:6, we have this verse, which is really our prayer for the disciples, that he who began a good work in them will bring it to completion on the day of Christ Jesus. In the beginning of this century, we saw many new challenges to this work.
In the year 2001, God added 1,200 new disciples. It was 53 new teams and 9 new churches, and that tested our faith. Then in the year 2002, once again, he added 1,600 new disciples, 70 new teams, and 16 new churches. And once again, our faith was tested as he began to expand this ministry. In the year 2003, it's now 2,600 new disciples, 110 new teams, and 5 new churches. And that's our 21st century hope at its beginning.
It was a thrill to see discipleship spread to communities, churches, and entire regions of Kenya and Uganda. One of the early pioneers was a man named Eli Bura, a pastor, a farmer and a pastor. He was the man I discipled Eli, but then the man I discipled gave up. But Eli never gave up until his death in 2005, as shown in my interview with him in 2003.
Homes, churches, and communities began to learn what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ.
You were discipled several years ago, so what year was that when you became a disciple?
I started in 1987, and I discipled many people, about 50, and that many people are disciple us, and we are moving to 2000, I think so.
It led to the association of 47 new churches from 1996 to the year 2000. People accepted Christ, became disciples, learned to be a church, and kept on making disciples.
For us, however, discipleship, mobilization, and multiplication was never meant to be a series of Bible studies alone. The transformation in individual lives was expected to have transformational influence in churches and communities. Disciples and disciple makers soon became engaged in such transformation.
Some have built health centers for their remote rural communities. Others have joined the battle against AIDS by helping widows and orphans. Some have joined the community to bring mountain water to their homes. Others provided school fees for children trapped in urban slums. When emergencies have arisen like Kenya's floods of 2003, disciples have been there to rebuild homes and provide food.
The houses were destroyed by the flood, and there were 25 in total, and then I managed to build 3.
Well, what transpired in the next 10 years from 2003 to 2013? Discipleship mobilization continued to spread and grow. It was exciting to see the numbers of new disciples grow by almost 13,000 people in just 5 years. This was influenced first by a vision of what we call Harvest 21.
Harvest 21 is a statement of faith that God will turn our 20th century beginning into a 21st century reality.
The growth was also influenced, secondly, by 2 features of Harvest 21, which were the Harvest Practicum and the Harvest Institute. The Practicum continued to support and encourage the mobilization by assuring the continuous availability of the 4 core tools, as well as other books and tools that were created along the way. The Institute, for its part, began in 2002 with the aim of providing college-level education for proven discipleship leaders.
The Harvest Practicum is the actual mobilization. It provides resources and training for 3 levels of discipleship commitment: disciples, disciplers, and networkers or team leaders. Quarterly seminars and workshops reinforce all the efforts. The Harvest Institute is the hub of the mobilization. Its aim is dedicated disciples in multiplied ministries. 2 levels of training support the previous 3 as group trainers go back to their regions in order to mobilize the people, and regional team leaders oversee their efforts as disciples.
Big changes were introduced between 2006 and 2009, however. These were made to remove our American presence from the leadership and turn it over to East African leaders instead. Harvest Impact Ministries grew out of these transitions and began to give its own direction to the Harvest Practicum and Harvest Institute. At the end of 2013, Harvest Impact Ministries began to make big changes to its programs. The Practicum, Institute, and Community Impact would all be affected. Is this frightening for us? Oh yes. But at the same time, it will be exciting to see what emerges. After all, just the two of us began the discipleship movement in 1985. We each discipled only one person during that year, but the two of us became 30,000 these 30 years later. So what will discipleship mobilization in East Africa require for the future? Just two people, or even just one, who will see that future in terms of the Great Commission of Christ in Matthew 28, 18 to 20. And they will learn as we have. Only what God does in the lives of disciples and disciple makers will last for all eternity.